they will almost certainly be an effective platform. They will almost certainly, though, not get straight off the production line brand new state-of-the-art F-16s. They will almost certainly be older F-16s.
They will be forced into, well, we talked about air superiority first, and that being a multi-role aeroplane, given air-to-air weapons, then they could take part in a campaign to secure air superiority first, and then switch to an air-to-surface role where they would be supporting the air force on the ground.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we're coming from the studio in London to look at air power and its part in the war in Ukraine, with a sharp focus on the F-16 fighter jets, for which the Ukrainians are so desperately waiting. I'm joined by Squadron Leader Ed Smith, a former RAF pilot who was selected to serve with the US Air Force flying the F-16 as part of an exchange programme. He took part in 26 combat missions with them after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait on Operation Desert Storm in 1990. And Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell, a pilot of the Harrier fast jet who has served on 3 tours of Afghanistan and who in his last role reported directly to the Chief of the Air Staff, heading a strategic combat air review. He is now a military analyst. Hello to both of you. Thank you very much for coming in to Frontline. Sean Bell, if I can start with you. How important will supremacy of the skies be for Ukraine to be able to win the war?
From a West perspective, we watched in the First World War and Second World War our forces getting decimated with attacks from the air, as a result of which Western doctrine now is to secure control of the air before any of your ground forces go forward, because the impact of them being attacked from the skies is just devastating. Now, Ukraine doesn't have the air power required to do that. So what it's trying to do at the moment is to do a counteroffensive against a global superpower in terms of Russia. And it's having to do that without the benefit of air power. So it is getting regularly attacked from the air, as well as having to throw itself against very established Russian defenses. That makes life extremely difficult for Ukraine. And undoubtedly, it would have been a major advantage to have Western air power on its side for this offensive.
Can it have air superiority without Western air power support?
The short answer to that is no, because there's been a lot of discussion about giving Ukraine F-16s. The F-16 is an incredibly capable aircraft. Ed has far more experience than I. I was fortunate enough to fly one on an exchange with the Dutch Air Force, just did one trip. But even if you were to deliver state-of-the-art F-16s to Ukraine tomorrow, they would not be able to operate them effectively. And the Russians, frankly, will be licking their lips. They would focus all their efforts at wiping that force out, because air power is not just about fast jets. It's about the whole range of other aircraft that are involved, that are surveillance, watching, listening, intelligence, electronic warfare. All of that has to come together. So whilst F-16s are an incredibly capable platform, they're not the answer to air power.
Ed Smith, Ukraine is desperate for the F-16 planes, which you flew in combat as far back as 1990. What were they like to fly?
It was a superb aircraft, very easy to fly, in fact. But as often said, flying it is very different from operating it. So although I'd got experience on other fast jets with the Royal Air Force, to then fly the F-16 was a straightforward transition just for the pure flying. But the course I was on was an incredibly intensive course of about 3 months. And I was given 25 flights to get to grips with this new aeroplane that I was now flying single seat, whereas previously I'd flown with a navigator assisting on radar, use of radar. So I was doing all that myself as well. So it was a very intensive course, but suited to the experience level that I had and others with me had.
And how long did it take you to feel completely confident flying it?
Yes. I think after that initial course, I then had to do some further training when I joined my operational unit, and that was another 3 months. So it was at the end of that period, I was beginning to feel more comfortable with it. Soon after that, we transitioned to an upgraded version of the F-16. So I had to go back to school again and just a very few flights there. Essentially the same aeroplane, but as possibly the Ukrainians might receive, subject to a lot of upgrades, and there was a lot of new equipment in it with
like
great
what?
capability. a much better navigation system, an improved radar, which would be central to the ability of the jet to be effective in combat use. And it had some other systems which wouldn't apply, I don't think, to the use here. A night terrain, low flying system.
But it's also worth pointing out, isn't it? You did an intensive course and you said about 6 months in that you then felt you were getting to grips. The one thing that Ed had before that was a great deal of experience of Western air power, different aircraft, and also he joined a squadron which had a huge amount of experience of the aeroplane.
Already doing it.
We're already doing it, could put a comforting arm around his shoulder.
And weren't under the pressure of combat going on in country.
So how much of a challenge would it be for the Ukrainian pilots to get to grips and to be able to fly the F-16s?
I think coming from a MiG-29 or a Tornado or an F-15 even it would be relatively straightforward to get to grips with that. You have that basic skills of a pilot, which has come from the selection onwards, really, selection, training and development. So I think that's possible, but as Sean says, to integrate that with a national system which might not be prepared for that sort of input, more challenging.
It's also worth pointing out, I think, we tend to get seduced by the air show mentality of a jet, fast, noisy, turning corners. The F-16 is incredibly agile. Unfortunately, air power and its combat capability has got nothing to do with that. It's to do with the technology in the radar, electronic warfare, all the systems there. And they have been upgraded regularly, almost on an annual basis, different software. And the older the aircraft, you'll still have a very capable aircraft, but its actual operational capability will be significantly reduced the older it is.
So are you saying then that the F-16s that go to Ukraine might not be that effective because of what's surrounding them?
They will almost certainly be an effective platform. They will almost certainly, though, not get straight off the production line brand new state-of-the-art F-16s. They will almost certainly be older F-16s. For example, the Dutch have recently retired their F-16s because they've moved to the F-35. That leaves F-16s that are previously loved available. Likewise, I think the Danes have recently retired their F-16s. So there are F-16s available, but many of them, I think the most modern, as I recall, was about 1990s vintage. So even those are 30 odd years old. And if you think back to what your mobile phone was like 30 years ago, your cars were like, and it's worth making clear, F-16s, 1970s, I think they were first. That was when the Mark I Golf first came onto our roads. And the Mark 8 Golf, which we're today, is a very different beast, and technology, radars, the like.
But still, there is the integration in the later F-16s, even the earlier models that have been upgraded. The essential part of the F-16 actually is the weapons it can carry, obviously. But it has got the latest air-to-air missiles with the radar associated with that, and guided weapons, air-to-surface weapons. If it has that capability as well, then you're beginning to realise the overall capability. But it's got to be integrated into, as we said earlier, But
do you think the West will be prepared to give state-of-the-art air-to-air missiles to Ukraine?
I think you're answering your own question,
yes,
not sure, aren't you?
No, it's an interesting question, isn't it?
So how might they be equipped?
Well, then, with the missiles on the MiG-29, Su-27, probably similar in capacity to some of the later Western ones.
One of the challenges, I think, here, which we tap dance around a bit, is that the West is prepared to support Ukraine, but is fully aware that some of the equipment will get into the hands of the enemy.
Yeah.
And therefore, the very latest technology is not something we would want to hand over. Let me give you an example. The press made a great deal about the Storm Shadow being handed over, which is incredibly capable. I don't know if you flew it.
I didn't fly it, but
amazingly capable,
tornado, yes.
Used in the Gulf War. But in context, that missile is nearly 30 years old now. We had bought, I think, initially 1,000 of them. We've used about 100 of them. We're going to be upgrading those missiles, but we're only going to upgrade a few of them. The rest we're going to have to be paid for disposal. So it's quite convenient to be able to give those to Ukraine because it saves us disposable cost. It's still a very capable missile, but it's not a state-of-the-art missile.
They have been used as already, haven't they, apparently?
Yes, well,
in
we
Ukraine.
don't know, but
How were they launched?
well, we launched the Storm Shadow as air launch, but you can launch them from land vehicles and from maritime. The danger is with air, obviously, if the aircraft is going 500 miles an hour, you give it a hell of a kick forward. But my point being is that we are nervous about giving Ukraine state-of-the-art equipment for fear that it will fall into the enemy's hands or exposes the West's hand. Technology is the West's asymmetric advantage. So there's a difficult balance to strike here.
Ed, you flew 26 combat missions. Can you tell me a bit more about the sorties that you carried out?
We initially flew what we call strategic long-range missions. We were flying from the United Arab Emirates, our deployment base. So we had a 1-hour transit before we approached the Kuwaiti and Iraqi borders. We then targeted, there were targets in and around Baghdad that we were aiming for. Command and control centres, weapon storage, power facilities. When we flew up to 40 aircraft from one base alone, but that was part of a larger package of fighter escort, the command and control, airborne command and control AWACS as well, suppression of enemy air defences was in a part of that, airborne as well with us. We never saw them, but they were out there defending us against surface-to-air missile attacks. So the whole package could have been 80 aircraft. We provided 40 of them. We were in clear skies, so we could operate at 30,000 feet with our weapons load and release those over the target and then make the trip home. We also, of course, had air-to-air refuelling. So that was a factor on every sortie. We were flying air-to-air refuelling just to give us the fuel and the range. We were flying typically then 5 or 6 hour missions. Later, with the capability that we had in our aircraft, we offered ourselves as a forward air control, airborne forward air control post. And we organised ourselves so that we would fly overhead target areas around the Republican Guard deployed in Kuwait and identify specific targets, which we could then instruct other fighters to make their attacks on. And that was a very effective mission, which the air commander at the end of the war said our unit of F-16s made a huge difference to the effectiveness.
Was that close air support you were doing?
It was a type of close air support because we carried our own weapons as well. But it wasn't close air support because we didn't have the troops at that time. The ground for war had not started, so we were operating in an environment of the enemy only, which is significant when you're comparing that to Ukraine.
When we're talking about the F-16s that might end up in Ukraine, how do you think they'll be best put to their best use?
They will be forced into, we talked about air superiority first, and that being a multi-role aeroplane, given air-to-air weapons, then they could take part in a campaign to secure air superiority first, and then switch to an air-to-surface role where they would be supporting the force on the ground. And there they would require the communication, the position data, understanding exactly what is happening on the ground to be effective and safe against their opponents.
And numbers, I mean, are they ever going to have enough of them to really make a difference? Because I understand if you don't get at least 40 to 60, there's not a lot of point.
Other NATO countries, Romania, I think, had an initial batch of 25, and I think they might have another batch coming to them. So there's an example maybe of a small newer NATO member country acquiring F-16s, and that's sort of minimum number they're looking at.
But they would generally want to do that as part of a package, though, wouldn't they? And that's why, NATO, this collective alliance, you contribute to it. Whereas at the moment, Ukraine isn't a member of NATO. Right. It has to have an autonomous capability.
Yes.
And exactly as Ed said, the first part is to secure air superiority over the air. But of course, the Russians will not give up control of the air, and they have some pretty impressive fighters available with some pretty impressive weapons.
And surface-to-air missiles.
Yeah.
Advanced surface-to-air missiles, which require, as we said earlier, that's a different type of mission required to control those.
Supposing the F-16s are in place, how do you think that they will stand up as part of Ukraine's air capabilities against what the Russians have at the moment?
The F-16 is a very capable aeroplane. It's got performance, it's got the altitude and speed performance. It's not a stealthy aeroplane, but it is small, and it is fairly low observability in radar terms. It's not easily seen in radar just because of its size. So it can be effective.
How soon?
The trouble is, I think the dangers, we're looking at it with a lens of today, and most of the Western nations are talking about providing F-16s not for today. They're talking about, even our Defence Secretary was saying that when the war finishes, there is an issue of security for Ukraine, and Ukraine will need to have its own air power capability.
So you think it might not even be part of the war itself?
Almost certainly. I think it would be very difficult to see it being part of, certainly this year, being part of the war. But in the post-war recovery, train the pilots is one of the you can get the jets there relatively quickly, you can get the weapons there relatively quickly.
And train the technicians.
And train the technicians.
To service.
But the pilot training is the thing that takes you a long time. So if they can lean into that, and I think that's why America and some other nations are looking to start the program, so that when there is a negotiated peace, you are more quickly able for Ukraine to stand on its own 2 feet and mount at least the seed corn of a credible air power capability.
What's the greatest vulnerability of the F-16, Ed?
Many F-16 pilots say it's not vulnerable to anything.
They would say that, wouldn't they?
We were fortunate in my squadron in the Gulf. 2 aircraft were hit by surface-to-air missiles, and they were both brought home.
Wow.
The pilots flew an incredible flight, 1 hour flight, one of them, including air refueling, with this aeroplane which was hanging on by the skin of its teeth to flight, and he landed it safely at a military airfield. The other one landed, scraped his nose along the runway, but he also survived. We were lucky. There were some other aircraft were lost and the pilots ejected. Most of them were safe. But
irrespective of how resilient the F-16 is, it must have vulnerabilities against modern surface-to-air missiles that the Russians have. What are they? Can you just go through what the potential problems would be?
Slightly difficult because of my out-of-date knowledge of the latest system capabilities, but against any surface-to-air missile initially, that can come, the target aircraft can come within range of that and has got to maneuver hard to avoid being hit by it. It's very difficult.
I think really part of it is that there are lots of techniques to avoid missiles. Missiles generally are either infrared or radar. Infrared, they track the signature, and of course you'll remember people just chuck out flares. The flares seduce the missile and off it goes. So a more modern generation of missile looks at the flares and goes, that isn't the same signature as the engine of that jet, and therefore ignores them. So now you have special flares that come out at a different temperature. Now the missiles have to be, so there's this constant upgrade, new measures, upgrade. And that is why if you enter that with an old bit of kit, suddenly you're facing a very capable surface-to-air missile system or whatever. The older missile systems that used to go up at the time, you could just maneuver and often defeat them. A more modern system, particularly the radar-guided missiles, are incredibly smart, incredibly capable, but they rely on a ping going out to your aircraft and the ping coming back. So electronically, I can capture that ping coming off that radar, mess around with it, and send a spoof signal back. And that's how I seduce that missile to miss me. The electronics in that are state-of-the-art. They're constantly being upgraded. And if you're not at the cutting edge of that, you're incredibly vulnerable.
And some of that will come from a specialist aircraft, which might not be the F-16. They might not have that capability on board to provide that countermeasures. So that's a separate
Yeah, so that was suppression of enemy air defences,
yes,
which we used to have in NATO, a specialist aircraft that was specifically there, that as soon as an enemy radar lit up on the ground that was going to launch a missile, would launch a missile that would home in on that radar signal and blow it up. So all of a sudden now, the enemy have got to get the radar lit up, got to find the aircraft, then launch something. All that time, there's a missile in the air to take them out. That is not something the F-16 does. No. That's a support aircraft. So it's a part of that suite of capabilities that preserves the F-16 to deliver the core job it can do. If it doesn't have those suite of capabilities, it becomes a lot more vulnerable.
This is probably
and
a second.
Do they have that suite of capabilities?
Say again?
Do they have that suite of capabilities?
The Ukrainians?
Yes.
No, they don't.
So,
and it's part of this process of achieving air superiority. Before you start advancing towards the enemy's surface-to-air missiles, you've got to take on the fighters that are defending the territory first and defeat them. And that's more of an air-to-air fight between an F-16 and its opponent in a pure air-to-air scenario, just concerned about that fighter threat. And if you can counter and win that battle, then you begin to think about the surface-to-air missiles, and then you begin to think about supporting troops on the ground.
And if, I'm sure Ed will lambast me for this one, but because I've never been an air-to-air pilot, but an air-to-air war, he who sees first generally wins. And what that means is if your radar picks up your enemy before he sees you, you can get a stick in the air and be firing something at him.
And that's a very sophisticated battle to fly, and it requires tremendous gymnastics.
And one which you say may never happen because the F-16 will be brought in once the war is probably finished.
I hope I'm wrong, but I'd be very surprised if they were to bring it in this year, the danger is it will be incredibly vulnerable because it wouldn't have this full supporting suite of capabilities around it.
And I understand there's a problem with the F-16s if the runways are not in good nick, which could be a problem in Ukraine.
The F-16 is sometimes known as a Hoover. It's got a very large air intake for the engine underneath the nose of the aircraft. It's not that far off the ground, further than some airliners who might have a similar problem. But it can suck up debris, any debris, tiny stones even. Small stones could begin to cause a problem to the engine.
Did you ever have an experience of that?
No, not directly. I mean, we're not immune from it in any jet aircraft. It can suck debris off the ground. It's very important to keep a surface clear, and that was a high priority on any base or any operating area.
Yeah,
the Harriers
yeah,
in the field would be a classic case of protecting the aeroplane.
If you're on a single engine aircraft, and a lot of fighter jets like the F-16 and the Harrier you had one engine, if it goes wrong, generally speaking, the aircraft doesn't glide. I mean, the Harrier used to glide like a set of keys through the sky. So, you were utterly reliant. A lot of older aircraft, the Jaguar, the Tornado, had two engines, which means you could lose one, and therefore you had some resilience. So you have to be a little bit more careful. But to be brutally honest, I don't think the F-16, exactly as Ed says, you sweep the runways a bit more regularly if you've got a problem with, it's not going to stop you having a military capability there. And at its heart, the F-16 is brilliant. And because it's the most widely sold aircraft in the world, it is almost certainly the right choice for Ukraine. The challenge is, I say once again, it's not about the platform, it's about how effective the radar, all of the various electronics, and how competent the pilot is at being able to operate all those systems. And you used to have the hands on throttle, didn't you? So on the throttle, and we had on the stick, but you have a little controller.
Yes.
Yeah. But on the...
You're almost flying
yes,
again, aren't you?
We're back there. But on the throttle and the stick, it's covered in buttons. And the idea is that you don't have to let go of the control column when you're in combat. Everything can be done from that. But if I give you an example, my thumb could operate a castellated switch, go forward, backwards, left or right, or down, or double back, or double forward. That was just my thumb. Trying to learn how to use all of the rest of the buttons, and every now and again a software upgrade would happen and they'd rearrange all of those switches. It's a bit like your typewriter, suddenly they rearrange all the keyboard.
Why do they rearrange everything to make it difficult for you guys to learn?
So software engineers who don't fly aeroplanes.
That's what it is it?
But it's not a simple thing to learn to make it intuitive.
It becomes muscle memory.
Yeah.
You get used to doing things.
How many times do you have to repeat something for it to sink in when you have a change?
We haven't talked about the effectiveness of simulation.
Yes.
And simulator training for any pilot these days is central to their development.
Because of the muscle memory and
They can spend as much time as they like in the simulator. It's not costing their money an expensive aeroplane does. And it allows any scenario at all to be established, set up, and practice those procedures. The latest ones now, two simulators or pilots in two different simulators can be talking to each other and flying a coordinated mission.
It also allows you to do the risky missions. So I've died many times, I'm sure Ed has, in a simulator to avoid you having to die for real. And it's quite sobering, but you can try things in a simulator which you wouldn't be able to try. And so the Americans who took a few Ukrainian pilots to see how long they would take, they did a really intensive period, didn't they?
Yes.
Of ground school, simulator and flying. And of course they weren't limited to 5 days a week, or they would literally blast them, and they did. I think it was 3 months. They got them competent at flying, which is fantastic. It just shows the benefits, exactly as Ed says, of the simulator.
You're going to be training this coalition that's going to be helping train the pilots to fly the F-16s. They're going to be getting probably rather tired people by the time they start their training, given what's going on at the moment. I mean, how long does it take to get someone physically up to speed and mentally up to speed and to have the capacity to actually fly?
I think, as we've said, I think the experience they will come with, if they've got current experience in fighter-type aircraft, they'll be at pretty high level of fitness and readiness to take on the training, and motivated, for sure.
For most fighter pilots, you get the chance to fly a different airplane.
You're excited.
You're going to be. It's like a school child. You're going to be absolutely pumping with excitement. I bet you were when you went across.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean,
it was a big program there, and a lot of pilots had the opportunity, but everyone was asking for it. Nearly everyone asked for an opportunity to go on exchange.
So how will the actual training take place? What will the pilots go through?
Very intensive technical training, understanding of the aeroplane, all the systems on board, how they work, what happens when they don't work, how to deal with that. And then the simulator program. I didn't have the benefit of a simulator when I went through the F16 course. It wasn't available. So we went straight from the classroom into the aeroplane.
Ouch.
Which increased the intensity just a bit. Yeah. I did call it the fire hose course, and it was.
So you flew a Hoover, having done the fire hose course.
Yes, metaphors. And then into the short flying program to touch each of the areas of expertise.
And how many hours do they need to have done to be effective?
It depends what you mean by effective.
Yes.
Okay.
So if I put Ed now in an aircraft to fly it, it's up, down, left, right, faster, slower. And it's the same on every aeroplane. And you could fly almost anything. Operating it is completely different. So the question about how effective means initially...
effective in combat.
Yeah, so and newly combat-ready pilots who are now effective, when they arrive off the training school and they're now ready to go, they're almost a liability to shipping. It's at the end of their first tour.
Learner drivers.
It is. It's the classic. You give them a license, they're free to go on the road, but they're not that competent. The insurance premiums are way high. The junior pilots, they call them JPs on a squadron, have to be very carefully supervised and monitored. And at the end of their first tour, isn't it really, when they are considered to be able to lead other people around and be competent. Now, clearly, we're talking about pilots here who have already mastered a lot of that. And if you're doing a crossover, you have a lot of latent experience and operational credibility. But did you find any issue? Because single seat now, you have to operate everything yourself. Did you find that a challenge?
Yes, the radar in an air-to-air mode, where you're looking at fighters in the air, targets in the air, is the most complex I found. That was
the F-16 radar?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. I'd flown the Phantom, which had a radar, but the navigator took responsibility for everything on the radar, and it was a very old radar. The F-16 one, much better. But there were a lot of disciplines and training and very much of this manipulating the controls on that, as well as the mental gymnastics then of recognizing what was happening with these targets on this scope, what that meant in the air, and when to launch a missile against them, how to maneuver against them, if they counter-maneuvered against you, defending against that. Very complex picture. But something that fighter pilots develop over the years. And yeah.
Do you miss it?
Like all work, you miss the good days and you don't miss the bad days at all. And there were some bad days, but mostly very good days. And yes, I miss some of that.
And how do you think, Sean, the experience of what's going on in Ukraine will form and inform the way NATO thinks about future air power?
I think one of the fundamental things that has already been discussed now is that most nations spend their own defence money on their own defence budgets, their own defence priorities. But Ukraine evidently needed help. If another country wants to invade you, most countries would not be able to protect themselves. They would need help from other nations. Now, whether that's NATO, whether that's bilateral, trilateral, or other arrangements, the one thing we don't do well in the West is that we are still very stovepipe. So when Ed was flying a Tornado, he would operate in his simulator, but he wouldn't be able to link that simulator to a tank simulator, to a ship simulator. So you can actually go to war as a joint force, and you certainly couldn't link that internationally. If we're going to operate effectively in international coalitions, we've got to find a smarter way of training together. And part of that is creating a networked ecosystem for training in the same way that my sons play Xbox Live against people the other side of the globe. They've got to find a common language, a common architecture for that training, because most of the training that you do in the live environment today is heavily regulated. You can't take any risks. Whereas when you go to war, you're operating at the edges of the risk envelope. You need to do that training in a simulator where you can explore the limits, go beyond them at times, and know that actually where those limits, what you can exceed and what you can't exceed. Because when you're at war, it's not a game, it's all about winning. And that's the thing we have failed to do. And Russia is a good example where, and China, massive military parades, they get all wound up about the equipment. When it comes to war, it's not about the equipment, it's about operational capability. It's how you've got well-trained people, motivated people, logistics, doctrine, and the like. And we've got
some clear objectives.
Absolutely right. And we've got to be, this has been a real wake-up call to a degree of complacency in the West that we've never expected to be able to have to take on a nation like Russia. And now that we have, there's been some significant shortcomings in stockpiles of weapons, our ability to regenerate them, our ability to operate internationally and train effectively together. I think there will be some significant changes in defence as a result of this.
Sean Bell, Ed Smith, thank you so much for your time. It's been great having you on Frontline. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.